Hello, everyone. It's Tiana Wolford, the CEO of SC Red, and I am so excited to launch our Changing the Narrative series. For far too long, we as individuals with sickle cell disease have had to prioritize survival over quality of life, but this is our opportunity to change that. In honor of Black History Month, our first interview is with Eloise Whitten, being interviewed by our very own Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Kim Smith-Whitley, and the one and only Dr. Wanda Whitten-Shurney.
Good afternoon. So glad to have you here for this very exciting event for me, because I have the honor of being the daughter of Mrs. Eloise Whitten, and that's who we're going to be talking to today. And I think that you're going to find that she's a very interesting and remarkable woman. Now, I need to tell you something about her professional background, but when we get into this interview, you're going to really understand who she is personally.
Oh, please.
So I will now read just a little bit about her education, and so you have some background on her. But when we start asking the questions, that's really when you're going to get the information that we really want you to have. Okay, so Eloise Whitten is a passionate and persistent advocate for civil rights and family planning. She was born and raised in Philadelphia. Mrs. Whitten received her bachelor's in political science from Temple University in 1950 and her master's from the University of Pennsylvania in 1951. Mrs. Whitten has been a champion for those who the system has forgotten and overlooked. Her passion stems from a desire to strengthen the Black family and set them up for generational success. She has been a professional volunteer serving on numerous boards, including Planned Parenthood. Her work continues as she was heavily involved in the launch of the Sickle Cell Reproductive Health Education Directive and was the first to sign on to be a member of their advisory board. So we are here today to learn more about my mother, Mrs. Eloise Whitten. Mom, some of this I know already, but even this whole experience, I've learned so much more, and it's been so enjoyable. So I want you to help us understand what motivated you to become involved in family planning. What was that motivation for you?
Well, Wanda, that's a long story that begins in another time and place.
Mm-hmm.
I had an aunt in the Bahama Islands over 100 years ago, and she got pregnant and she wasn't married.
Mm-hmm.
And her brother disowned her.
Mm-hmm.
He told the rest of the family that Sarah's no longer a part of our family. He put her out of the house, and she literally had to go and live in a little shack behind their big house.
Mm-hmm.
And she got sick while she was out there. And she told me at one time that if my mother hadn't brought her food and taken care of her, she didn't know if she would have survived. And Sarah was there until her godmother brought her into her house. And then when her baby was born, they took care of the baby, and Sarah went to New York to make a new life for herself, which turned out to be satisfactory and happy for both of them.
Mm-hmm. So that was it was the devastation that being an unwed mother.
Yes.
That was key, wasn't it?
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Reuben made it clear that that's the worst possible situation that a person could be in, that it disgraced the family, that it ruined the potential for her life. And I knew as a little girl that was the worst thing that could happen. I imagine the family talked about it,
mm-hmm.
and I learned about it from then. But as a little girl, I was taught that to be unmarried and have a baby was the most disgraceful, the worst thing that could happen to you.
Mm-hmm. That's a pretty serious motivation for being involved in family planning.
Yes.
But there was also this issue with grandma and the diaphragm. Can you talk to us about that?
Yes. I was rummaging in her drawer one day, and I came across this diaphragm. Now, my mother wasn't a person who gave me a lot of sex education. Mm-hmm. She couldn't handle it.
Right.
But when I took the diaphragm and I ran into the kitchen to show it to her and to find out what it was, and she told me, she said, Eloise, this is a diaphragm. Mm-hmm. She said, the doctor told me that I mustn't have any more children, and he gave me this diaphragm so that I wouldn't get pregnant.
Yeah.
That was all she told me. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't interested in anything else. Yeah. And I took it and put it back in the drawer, and that was that. Yeah. Then one of the really big things that happened to me.
Know, before you leave that, Mom,
yes.
I just want to kind of bring up the fact that the reason Grandma was able to talk to you about that was because she perceived it as being medicine.
I was going to say that later.
Yeah, okay. I'm sorry.
That's all
See,
right.
I know you too well. Okay, I'll back off. Go ahead.
All right. So I remember that a young woman who lived across the street from me, and I knew, she died in childbirth. And I was very, very upset about it. And I said to Mother, now I'm 13 now. Right. I said to Mother, why didn't she use her diaphragm? And Mother said to me, well, she couldn't have a diaphragm because a diaphragm was a medical issue. Okay. And the only reason I had one was because the doctor said that I would have a difficult time if I got pregnant again because my kidneys were in such bad shape. Right. So she was able to talk to me about that, as you said, right, because she didn't think of it as sex. Yeah. She thought of it as medicine. Right. Because I asked her much later how she was able to handle that with me. Yeah. And she told me because she felt it was medicine and not sexuality. Yeah.
So, those are, of course, stories that I've heard before.
Yes.
And I just, I just think it's fascinating that at such a young age, you became focused on such important issues.
Yes.
Yes. That moved you to that. So,
and the other thing that I don't know exactly how to say it, but I realized afterwards how really troubled I was about the young woman getting pregnant across the street. And I thought to myself, well, you were only 13 years old, and yet you were so distressed by that.
Yeah.
And I really, felt like there ought to be something done so that she could have had a diaphragm.
Right.
That's the way I talk about it. So she shouldn't have had to have the third baby when she died.
Yeah.
One of the things that I just enjoy is watching the two of you have this conversation. So you have really spoken about what motivated you to become involved in family planning. Can you tell us that next step and talk about how you became involved with the reproductive health movement and Planned Parenthood?
Yes. My husband and I moved to Buffalo, New York after we were married. And somehow, I'm not sure, the Planned Parenthood people there found out that this new young woman had come into town, and they called and asked me if I would serve on their board. Well, I was delighted because that fell in with my interest in sex ed and human sexuality and the reproductive system. So I told them, yes, I would come on their board. I served for 3 years until Charles and I moved to Detroit. When I got to Detroit, I got a telephone call from the Planned Parenthood here in Detroit. And they told me that they'd had a call from the people in Buffalo who told them that their board member had come to Detroit and they'd like to have her asked to serve on the Detroit board. So a couple of days later, I got a phone call from the chairman of the board of the Detroit branch of Planned Parenthood Federation of America. And Mrs. Ray asked me if I'd like to serve on their board. And I told her, no, my children were too small and I wasn't ready to leave them yet, but I would like to join later. So she said, well, think about it some more and then let me know. So I then got a surprise telephone call from the executive director of Planned Parenthood. And she asked me, Ms. Whitten, are you Black? And I was surprised. And I said, yes, I am. but how did you know? And what difference does it make? She said, well, I discovered it when I looked at your zip code and I saw the neighborhood that you live in. Then I knew what your race was. She says, I need to tell you this. She said, if you're interested in Planned Parenthood, she said, you need to come on the board now because we don't have any Black people on the board. And if they discover that you're Black, you will not be asked again. So I decided right then and there that I was going to accept the invitation. And I'll never forget how surprised everybody was when I walked in the room. And the best thing that happened for me was that the chairman of the board got up from her seat and came over and greeted me. And when she greeted me, she didn't just offer me her hand, she put her arm around my shoulders and really embraced me. And I think that gave me more standing with the group when I joined.
Sure did. Yeah.
So that was
That-
how that happened. That was how I happened
Yeah.
to get onto the Detroit board. Now, I enjoyed my work on the board, but I was constantly running into these little social psycho issues because the board was composed of a lot of very, very wealthy people. And my husband was earning $12,500 at Wayne State University Med School. And I wanted to make a contribution to the organization too, but I offered to make an in-kind contribution rather than a financial contribution because I wanted it to be substantial. I didn't want to contribute $10 when everybody else was giving $1,000. So I told them that I would like to go into the Brewster Douglas housing project, which was nearby, and I'd like to talk to the women there about family planning, because I had learned from my young social work friends at Wayne State University that you shouldn't wait for the client to come to you. You should go to the client. And so I decided that that's what I would do. And that was a very, very interesting experience for me. First, I learned that the women knew more about family planning than I thought. But the department wasn't allowed to give them information, or it wasn't allowed to introduce the subject to them. So they said they would like some help with that. But the way that I did my education, I'll say, was I would get one woman to open her house and to invite other women to come in. I used to call them coffee clatches. And then we would move from one house to another, and we would have coffee and donuts, and we would have as much discussion about family planning and about birth control techniques and everything that the mothers wanted to hear. And they were very pleased and gratified to know how they could get the information and reach a Planned Parenthood office. And that was how that part of it went.
Yeah, and Mom, the really interesting thing about that to me is that these clatches, your insight that I need to go to the people and meet them where they are and hear what their concerns are. And
Thank
then
you.
when you learned that the problem wasn't that they didn't know about birth control, is that they didn't know how to get it,
That's
then
right.
you were able to address that issue, and the only
thank
other
you.
thing I want to say about that is that those coffee clatches really remind me of what Tiana is doing in terms of the fireside chats, so it just is the things, it really kind of comes full circle.
Yes.
It's amazing that
Yes.
you're at least doing something like that.
That's right.
That you, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well,
Mrs. Whitten,
yes.
when I hear these incredible stories of strength and insight, it really calls to mind how much you must have been dealing with in challenges and barriers for women of color during that time period. You got your bachelor's degree, your master's degree from Ivy League institutions at a time where many people were doing that. You took on a movement that must have been still controversial in that day and age. How did you find this inner strength to do all of this?
Well, it's very interesting. My political science education helped me at some point, but it helped me to frame birth control in a different way from the understandings that a lot of the clients had. There was a lot of feeling that birth control was an attempt at genocide, that it was a way to reduce the Black population. And when I would talk about birth control, I would talk about the fact that the people who were denied birth control by the regulations were primarily poor Black women, and that it really was a civil right that they were entitled to, but that they couldn't get because of the regulations. So I realized that something had to be done about that, and it would have to be done at a different level. So about the same time, George Romney decided to run for governor in Michigan, and I liked him and I helped him campaign. And my reward was to put me on the statewide social services board. And I called him and said, Governor Romney, I want to propose that we change the rules and regulations so that welfare women can get birth control information. And he said to me, Eloise, that's what he called me. He said, stop calling me, do what you want to do. So that set me free. So I went back home and was talking to people about how I could get that done. And somebody said, you must go to Lansing, Michigan, and talk to the young legislator, the state representative. His name was Coleman Young, and he became an outstanding mayor in Detroit, served 4 terms. So I went to Lansing to meet this Coleman Young. When I started talking, he said to me, Mrs. Whitten, I've read your material. Tell me what you want me to do. So I was surprised at that approach. And so I started talking and slipped again. And he said, Mrs. Whitten, I told you I read your material. Now, what do you want me to do? And I said, Mayor Young, I want you to do something to change the regulations so that the Black women can get birth control. He said, Mrs. Whitten, listen to this. He said, I can't get caught out on a branch with a bunch of Republican legislators who want to cut the welfare rolls. He said, if you find me a couple of strong Democrats who will say that poor women really do want to control their families and they do want birth control for the right reasons, I'll help you. So I came back to Detroit and started looking around, and I saw a union, a strong union man. I've got to call his name. At any rate, Horace Sheffield was his name. And I went to Mr. Sheffield and I said, because I was sort of new in town and I didn't know all the power people and what have you. So I said to Mr. Sheffield, would you call Coleman Young and tell him that you understand the community and Black women do want birth control? He said, yes, I will. So then, as I say, I didn't know many people. And I said to Mr. Sheffield, who else should I go to? And he said, you must go to George Crockett and ask him to call Coleman Young. So I did. I called Judge Crockett, and he was very helpful. And the next thing I knew, Coleman Young had pushed all the right buttons, and the legislation was transacted to make birth control available to the welfare mothers. And I was so proud of that because I thought that was such a critical issue and they wanted it. So that's how that happened.
So she, Kim was asking you a little bit about education, and I just wanted you to share.
Oh,
Yeah, you got to share why education is so important.
I got carried away.
Yeah, nope, you're doing just right.
All right, we have to go back to that other time and place about the education. Everyone said that my father was one of the brightest kids that ever grew up on that island of Eleuthera, little island. At any rate, he did so well in school. And just a little side story, when his older brother went to school at 6, Daddy wanted to go to school so badly with him, he would follow along behind the bigger boys and go to school. And the teacher would send them home. And that went on for a while, and his mother was desperate. And one day she put a little dress on him, and she thought he wouldn't go out of the house in the dress. Daddy snuck out of the back door and followed the boys to school. And when the teacher saw how motivated he was to go to school, he sent the message back to his mother to send him to school. And then Daddy indeed began school at 4 years old. He did very, very, very well. And they had a practice there that if you passed something called the Cambridge exams, you were eligible for a scholarship. And Daddy finished the exam at 16, not 18, where most people finish it. But when they found out that he was Black, they withdrew the offer of the scholarship to Cambridge. And it broke his heart. He never really recovered from the disappointment, but it caused him to push my sister and me for education. And I actually knew that I was going to have to go to college by the time I was in junior high school. So that was the real motivation for us. My father wanted me to go all the way through to the doctorate, but that wasn't my goal. But that's what motivated us. And my mother was a very, very intelligent woman, but her life went so that she couldn't start school at 5. She started at 8, and she couldn't stand being with children so much younger. And she decided to quit school. And I was always disappointed about that because it would have opened some other things to her if she'd been able to get more education.
Mm-hmm. That's so inspiring. And it just really emphasizes so many things that we as people of color have had to endure over the years, right? And
Yes.
I think that
Yes.
one of the things that strikes me about that strength and that perseverance in your story is that you went to pass that on to your daughters.
Yes.
And I think that that is just so inspiring to see how this has carried on now for generations in your family. One of the other things that I just wanted to mention, and it's kind of something that was shared with me in an earlier bio that I read with you about you. And it said that in your family, there's a phrase that has become a slogan. And when I think about how you have taken on such challenges and overcome so much, it says that there is a slogan, there is such a thing as enough. Can you talk to me about how that slogan came to be in your family and what you hope it passes on generations forward?
That's interesting because one of my daughters came home and said that she had been talking to one of her friends and that he had told her the slogan, "There is such a thing as enough." And she was so impressed with it and impressed with him because he had brought it to her. And we talked about it. We talked about it quite a lot. Our family already lived modestly, and we we always felt that there should be a desire to have what you needed to be happy and to do well, but that after that, a lot of it really wasn't important. And we did little things along the way. I'll tell you a story about Wanda.
Mhm.
Wanda came home from school one day and told me about a little girl who wore the same dress practically every day. And I looked at her, and when Wanda would ask me those kinds of questions, I would say, well, Wanda, what do you want me to do about it? And she said, well, Monty, can't we get her some clothes? Oh, that's what I mean. We had enough to do that. So first, I asked mother, would it be all right if we made a gift to her daughter? And she was very happy. And so I got this little wardrobe for this little girl, and we took them to her. A couple of days later, Wanda said, Mother, you know, she's wearing the dresses, but her brother is wearing the pants. So I realized we hadn't bought anything for him either. But my point was just that we didn't have a lot of money. That was very, very early in our lives. And as I told you, my husband wasn't making much at the university, but we always felt that we had enough so that we should share some rather than just throw it away and on things that we didn't need or what have you. We weren't saints, but you know, we saw an opportunity to be helpful, and we used to try to take advantage of those opportunities.
Yeah, and Mom, I think one of the main things, I mean, even as we look at the world today, I think a big part of the problem is that a lot of people don't know that there's a such thing as enough, you know. But I think one of the big things that it did for me and for Lisa is to allow us to choose a career that was important to us rather than a career that would make a whole lot of money. You know, so being a pediatrician as opposed to maybe trying to be, well, I wouldn't qualify to be a surgeon anyway, but you know, just to be able to choose something that you would feel happy going to work every day.
Yes.
And not just making the most money.
And it was one of the reasons that I was able to have the volunteer life that I could have.
For sure.
Because as I say, we lived modestly and in what's the word I'm looking for? Homes that weren't grand, and that left us the money to do things that we felt were helpful in the community.
I really, you know, for you to be able to do that, all of that on a volunteer basis, you know, really speaks to the idea that there's a such thing as enough, because you're not looking for looking for a way to change the world.
Well, a lot of our friends couldn't understand how we could decide to live on one income, given also that my husband wasn't a practicing doctor. He was working at the university, but we managed to have everything we needed.
So Mom, I gotta take my glasses off. Mom, you refer to yourself as a militant, right? And I couldn't agree with you more. Okay. And your life has been militant in the most memorable ways, you know. And could you take a moment to just talk about some of the most memorable events in your advocacy journey?
Well, I'd like to tell you about an experience at Temple University, because I always acknowledge that being a militant in the 50s was different from being a militant in the 70s. I mean, there was more danger involved and you took bigger risks. However, there was an issue at Temple. It happens that I was the president of the junior chapter of NAACP at Temple at that time. And there was an issue over the Red Cross collecting blood at Temple University. They wanted to bring a bloodmobile and for the students to come out and contribute. But my sister discovered that there was a question on the application about race. And she came to me and said, Eloise, we have to do something about that. So we got in touch with the Red Cross and said that we understand there's an indication for race on the form. And they said, yes, we do that. But we had talked, there were a lot of veterans who had just come to Temple. That was 1946, and that was the year that they got out of the service. And the veterans said, well, if people don't want Black blood, which is what it was all about, then they could do without it. And there was a huge debate at Temple, and we were called into the president's office, and he said he thought we were traitors. It was written up in the Bulletin newspaper, and my father was so worried. When you talk about a risk, he was afraid that we were going to get dismissed from Temple. We ended up having a referendum, and the students voted not to let the Red Cross come to Temple. And the Red Cross was so upset, and they had all their meetings and what have you. And it was reported in the newspaper that they decided to remove the question from the form. And at that point, and we were 18 and 17 years old, it was very, very important to me that we were able to do that at that time. So I'll stop there. You don't need anything more.
Okay, no, you can't stop there, because you have to say something about the National Presidential Health Conference. Because,
I received an invitation because of my work in the reproductive health system to the White House Conference on Health. And I was so proud and went to the conference. And of course, at that time, birth control was really, really controversial, and everybody tried to avoid it. And at the conference, they were talking about the issues that they were going to deal with. And of course, I stood up and said, how are you going to handle family planning, birth control? Much to everyone's consternation. Now, what I didn't know was that there was a man standing right by me whose name was Dr. Alan Guttmacher, and he was the president of Planned Parenthood. And I'm repeating, we're talking about 1960, the really early days. And he went back to New York and asked one of his colleagues, do you know who that young Black woman in Detroit is? And she said, I told you about her. He picked up the phone and called me and asked me if I wanted to join the national board. And of course, I was out of my mind with joy. And that was how I got onto the national board, because usually you get appointed from your local Detroit board, but they wouldn't nominate me to the national board. And so I got chosen by the president of the national organization. And it really was gratifying for me, because I thought how much closer that could get me to dealing with the issues that I thought were important in human reproduction.
Yeah. And so Kim, you see why I thought that was such an important thing to.
Absolutely.
You don't get to choose your parents, right? And then who did I get? Dr. Charles Whitten and Mrs. Eloise Winifred Whitten, right?
Stop.
Okay. And I look at, the comparison of how my mom brought reproductive health issues to the forefront nationally, and how my dad brought, sickle cell issues to the forefront nationally. We're still working on that. And I just feel like having had these two parents and being raised in a way that you see everyone as equal, and that you treat everyone with respect, and it just brings to me that whole idea of how warriors living with sickle cell disease are stigmatized, and the thing that it really brings to my mind is that whole idea of being called a sickler. and how we have worked so hard against that for the people that don't appreciate it, who don't want that. Some people embrace it, but if you don't want to be termed that, we don't want you to be stigmatized in that way. And Mom, you have a similar, and I think this is kind of what made me pay so much attention to this, because you had something to do with decreasing the stigmatization
Yes.
of young women.
Yes.
Can you just talk for a minute about
Yes.
that? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'd like to mention briefly that one of the seeds that my father planted in terms of respecting everyone and treating everyone with dignity, we lived in a very, very multicultural and socioeconomically varied neighborhood. And there was a young guy in the neighborhood who couldn't find his way. He was just sort of around. He wasn't exactly what we call homeless now, but he would just do odd jobs in the neighborhood. And sometimes he would drink his wine out of the bottle in a paper bag. And my father said we should still treat him politely. And one day, Mother and Olga, my sister, and I left the house. And when we came back, he was sitting on the front doorstep holding the keys to our door. And Mother said to him, why didn't you just throw the keys inside? He said, no, Miss Comer. He said, I was afraid somebody might go into your house. And that was our reward for treating him with dignity. Now, the important one. I have a friend, Dr. Andrew Billingsley, possibly the most outstanding Black sociologist in the country. And Andy always talked about self-determination and giving people the power to create their own life circumstances and to impact on their life circumstances. And I was asked to chair a committee to determine how to use the Florence Critton Association, their budget in Detroit, because they had moved away because they were frightened by the riot. And so I was asked to chair this committee to determine what we would do with that budget. I remember what Andy said about talking to the people that you're serving to find out what they want and what they need, rather than just moving ahead. So my committee went and we talked to some young women in other programs in the city. And when I walked in the door, the first thing they said to me was, Mrs. Whitten, we don't like the term illegitimacy. Our babies are not illegitimate, and we don't want to be called that. That really, really impressed me. It led to our changing the name of the committee. So everything that had illegitimacy study committee on it was changed, committee to deal with the problems of unwed parents. And I know my friend was very, very pleased about that. And it started a nationwide, I don't want to be too grandiose about it, but gradually the term illegitimacy has been dropped all over the country. And we talk about unwed parents. And that was another thing that I was very proud of. It was sharing power and enabling people.
Mrs. Whitten, the Sickle Cell Reproductive Health Education Directive, or SC-RED, aims to advocate for high quality reproductive health care for individuals living with all types of sickle cell disease. Considering your strong family's history with sickle cell and your long history of advancing equitable reproductive care, what advice can you give the co-founder and CEO, Tiana Woolford, as she executes the mission of this organization?
I'd like to say first, instead of starting right out with advice, my daughter told me about this young woman who had discovered the reproductive issues around sickle cell anemia. and that she was busy organizing an agency that would provide this unmet need for the sickle cell community. When I talked with her, I said to myself, who is this young woman who thinks she can do all this at such a young age and what have you? But before the phone call was finished, I knew who this young woman was who thought that she could create an agency. She had her organizational structure plan, she had her board plan, she had all of the work done that would be done by the most mature, competent person developing an agency. And I was so astounded and so happy to have been asked to work with her. But now I'll tack on a couple of things. One, you need to be connected politically. I know you heard my story with Coleman Young, and you don't want to let anybody tell you that you can't do one thing or another. I know you already have that, but when I was working to change the legislation for birth control to welfare mothers, one of the legislators came to me and he put his toe right against my toe. And he said, Mrs. Whitten, you'll never live to get birth control for ADC women. That's age-independent children. And I looked at him, and that even made me more stubborn in terms of the work. So you must get politically connected. Sometimes that's through the board or other ways. Then I wanted to tell her to have as strong a staff as you can get, because you really need to take care of yourself as an executive. Sometimes executives are so busy taking care of other people that they don't take care of themselves. And a strong staff will help you be able to delegate things so that you don't have to be on top of every single thing and wearing yourself out. And I think those are the important things that I wanted to say to Tiona, and to congratulate her again on the wonderful job that she's done, and to thank her especially for allowing me to be involved in this really, really worthwhile project.
Well, I think that is excellent advice. And I think that this has been a wonderful experience. And I just really appreciate you, Kim and Tiana, and for you recognizing the jewel that is Eloise Whitten-Shurney.
Thank you, Wanda. Stop your embarrassing me.
Yeah. And so I think this is great. I think people will really enjoy learning more about my mom.
I agree.
Thank you.
For more information, you can follow us at www.sicklecellred.org.